Well, hello everyone, and welcome to a new show that we're doing today. We're recording live from Studios B3, and I'm Spencer Brinkerhoff III. Today is Monday, January 2nd, and of course we're talking Star Wars. Now, the Star Wars Rebel TV show has been on break for the past few weeks, and during the show's downtime, let's see, a little movie came out. What was that thing called again? That's right. Rogue One, a Star Wars story. So, with the events of Rebels happening so close to the timeline of Rogue One, I was very anxious, very interested to see if there would be any connections with these two stories. And while there were some connections, the biggest crossover character from the animated series actually came from the Clone Wars TV show. That's right, I'm talking about Saw Gerrera. Now, way back in September of 2012, the fifth and the final broadcast season, and that's the broadcast season, not the YouTube season, the broadcast season of the Clone Wars included a 4-part storyline all about the rebel fighters on the planet of Onderon. Now, Saw Gerrera was one of these rebel fighters, and we learned in Rogue One that he had never stopped fighting the Empire, and we got to see, spoiler, his end in Rogue One. Now, we bounce around a little bit in the timeline here, but we saw the character of Saw Gerrera. He first showed up in the Clone Wars, and then we jump forward a few years, and the animated character comes to life. He appears in Rogue One, and now we jump back in time a little bit to the second half of Star Wars Rebels, and guess what? Saw is back for the 2-part mid-season premiere titled Ghost of Geonosis. Now, since we're having a little bit of a blast from the past with the return of these Star Wars, Clone Wars characters, it seemed only fitting that I should reach out to my co-host. Actually, I think that he was the host and I'm the co-host from the Clone Wars Roundtables and the Rebels Roundtable, Mr. Eric Geller. Eric, welcome to my thing.
Thank you for having me, Spencer. It's so great to be back. This is the first Star Wars podcast I've done in a while, and I'm happy to do it.
Now, for Star Wars podcast, have you been doing some other podcasts?
No. I've never really done any podcasts besides Star Wars. So I guess I think of Star Wars podcasts as all the podcasting I ever do. It's kind of synonymous with podcasting for me.
Okay, that's perfect. Now, I had a couple of questions for you. Now, there may be some people out there who, and this is a little surprising to me, that may not know who you are and what you have done with Star Wars podcasting. Now, can you tell us how you first started up in doing your Star Wars podcasting?
Sure, yeah. So I had been working behind the scenes on the Star Wars podcast network called The Forcecast for several years, basically since I turned 18, I was helping out behind the scenes there. And then several years went by, the old hosts left for another network. And I was asked to be originally it was one of the 2 co-hosts on the main show. We started adding other shows. Of course, Spencer, I brought you in to do the Clone Wars Roundtable. That became the Rebels Roundtable. And it sort of took off from there.
It was amazing. Now, in all of the different interactions that you had with the podcasting, do you have a favorite memory? Like in my mind, I've got a picture, and you probably, I don't know if you'll bring this one up or not, but what would you say is your favorite memory or experience from being involved in the Star Wars podcasting?
Well, I remember probably the most like work intensive period of my podcasting work was the fall of 2014. I think we were getting ready to do a big Star Wars Reads Day special, and it was probably the hardest that I've ever worked for like one particular episode of the show, because we had to schedule 3 or 4 author interviews, and anybody who's ever scheduled an interview with a Star Wars author knows you've got to go through a lot of scheduling, you've got to go through a lot of PR. It's tough, and we had to do I think 3 or 4 of those. One of them was 2 people at once. We had to do some extra sort of content to put in there with the interviews. So it was a lot of work, but it was one of the most rewarding experiences because it gave me a sense of what it takes to produce something like a radio or a TV show when it isn't just 2 or 3 people talking, but when it is really a lot of pre-recorded, heavily edited stuff. So it made me appreciate that a lot, and listening back on it, it gives me a sense of how much fun it was.
Oh, that's awesome. Now the thing that instantly popped into my mind is some pictures that showed up online of you sitting down, sort of like you were the panel host for a Star Wars. I think it might have been a Clone Wars thing, and there's Dave Filoni and all of these like big Star Wars stars, and then there's Eric Geller sitting there. I was like, man, who is this guy? This is so awesome.
Oh, I think that was the second version of the Why We Love the Prequels panel, which was a celebration thing that Kyle Newman and a bunch of other folks put together. And I was really surprised and honored to be asked to be part of it. And I remember that now. Dave showed up about maybe a quarter or halfway through, and he walked onto the stage. Of course, he's a celebrity everywhere he goes, and just to be able to sit on a stage with him, to forget about what we're talking about, for me to be able to say that I sat on a stage as a co-panelist with Dave Filoni, at the time, that was a big deal for me, and it's really cool to look back on.
Yeah, it's still a really big deal, and that's something else that I want to point out is that one of the things that you have consistently brought to the table is your ability to think and articulate the questions that we all sort of like have had in our minds, and even those that are like completely out of left field. You bring things up and you bring a whole new light onto the discussion, and I've always appreciated being able to have these discussions with you. So for all of that,
well, thank you.
No, thank you, Eric, really. Now, in all of this sort of like media production, the research that goes into it, the rewatching of the episodes. Now, how does this prepare you for your current life? What are you working on nowadays?
So right now, I am a reporter at Politico, which is a publication that mostly covers Washington, D.C., policymaking, Congress, the White House, and I report on cybersecurity. So anybody who's been following the news for the past year will probably know that there's been a lot of hacking, a lot of cyber attacks. It was a big part of the election. It started the same day that I started my job at Politico. That was the first major.
Yeah. Is that good?
It was good in the sense that it gave me a lot to work on, and it allowed me and the people who work with me to show that this is an important topic. And so, as difficult as the past year has been for many, many people, it has been rewarding for me to put my skills to work. And I think you're right that the research, the planning, the note taking, the organization of your thoughts, that's incredibly important for me because I have to be able to interview people and know the right questions to ask. I have to learn about who they are. I have to learn about what they've done. And the note taking that I did not only for the Clone Wars Roundtable, but also for interviews for theforce.net and for other things in my past have been incredibly helpful.
Now, I saw an article recently that said Star Wars has always been political. Do you ever sit at your day job and kind of think, oh my gosh, this is so Palpatine right now? Do you ever think, well, I can totally see how this works in episode 2 when they did this? I mean, are you overwhelmed with Star Wars references in your day job, or I mean, is it just is that a completely different crowd you're dealing with?
No, I mean, I wouldn't say I'm overwhelmed, but I would say that there are definitely moments that remind me of the motifs that George Lucas was trying to weave into the prequels. I mean, I remember Steve Bannon, who is the senior advisor to Donald Trump, who will be entering the White House in a few weeks. He did an interview where he talked about how it's important to embrace kind of dark maneuvering and manipulation. I think he said he compared himself favorably to Palpatine, and it was very interesting to read because it is a reminder of the fact that these are fictional characters, but they are really behaving in very human ways. They are taking advantage of other people and planning and organizing the same way that real people do. And frankly, it's a good advertisement for the prequels because as many problems as those movies had, they were really great at capturing the notion of a democracy on the brink and the people who are working on both sides of that conflict. So I would say, yeah, I mean, absolutely. There are people at my job who love Star Wars and who are very keyed into the political motifs, and it makes it can make work a lot of fun.
Right. Well, and one of those political motifs that we're dealing with right now is the rebel element. We've just watched Star Wars Rogue One, the Star Wars story, and there has been a lot of coverage about the return of Saw Gerrera. We saw him in the Clone Wars when things were really heated, and he was part of this rebel movement. And I see a lot of political sort of like similarities there as well. We've got the government of the Republic, that the Jedi are saying, listen, this government here on Onderon has decided that they are going to align themselves with the Separatists. As such, we can't come in and just sort of like train these rebels, but the rebels are asking for help. And Anakin is sort of like making this fight back and forth. So we start back with, again, season 5. Oh gosh, I forgot which episode it was. Anyway,
Episode 2.
Episode 2, A War on Two Fronts. And Anakin is sort of like pleading the position of the rebels on Onderon, and he's saying, listen, these guys are not terrorists. They're, what did he call them? Do you remember? Did he call them freedom fighters? Or
He says, I think of it as an insurgency.
Okay, an insurgency. So here we go. Anakin is saying we need to support them and we need to help them out. And this is where we first meet Saw Gerrera. So what do you think about the way that Anakin was sort of like introducing himself into this struggle, and whether or not it was the right thing? Is there a difference between calling them terrorists or insurgents, or are they really all the same things? Are the rebels all terrorists, or is it just depends on which side of history you're on?
Absolutely. I think what this shows is that the Jedi are accountable to a very slow-moving and very bureaucratic institution, which is the Senate, and they have to, they can't just sort of act impulsively, because there are people watching what they do who have to think about the nuances. And so when Anakin says that it's more of an insurgency than a terrorist group, I mean, he's basically saying we can frame this in a positive way. We can make this into something that benefits us, rather than making it look like we support terrorists. And there is also a moment where Obi-Wan says that they can't train terrorists, and Anakin says they're actually rebels, not terrorists.
Right.
And again, it's a reflection of the fact that words matter, and that, especially as we see later on, once the rebels on Onderon start making speeches, it's all about winning public support, and public support is based on what people hear, and what people hear is based on the words that people choose.
Right. And that's part of your job, is making sure that those words get out there, and making sure that they're the right words for the right situation.
Exactly.
So in this scenario, we first met, I think that the first person that our Jedis meet as they show up on Onderon is Steela. And Steela leads them into camp, and they introduce everybody. And she kind of like introduces them to Saw Gerrera, and she points out that Saw thinks that he's the leader of this group, although nobody really even voted for him. And we get to see the contrast between Steela and Saw. And I think that they wait a couple of episodes to actually point out that these two are brother and sister. So in the two, how would you frame up these two different character types, Steela versus Saw Gerrera?
Well, Steela seems very much to be a calming influence on Saw. He is very essentially fed up with politics, and he says at one point, politics have failed us. We have no choice. He's talking about fighting. And Steela says, there's a time and a place for fighting, and there's a time and a place for talking, for making speeches. And she sort of, she gets in between Lux, who really is more about speech making,
right.
And Saw, who's more about fighting. And she is basically, this is foreshadowing, because she eventually becomes the leader, but she knows how to bring two different perspectives into harmony. And she is the one who is essentially keeping Saw in check for this episode.
And I'm really glad that you brought up Lux Bonteri, because in this scenario and with the writing of these episodes, what happens is Lux represents the voice of the Senate. His mother was killed. She was a senator, and he is the political sort of like white collar guy. And Saw Gerrera is, the guy who's boots on the ground. He's working for this stuff, and he wants to make action. And then Lux says we need to talk about this. And those two oppositions, Steela is right in the middle of them, helping to sort of like frame the real conversation, and know when we need to fight and know when we need to, just talk about this. I also wanted to point out that something that's missing from that I've missed from Star Wars Rebels that I always loved from the Clone Wars is the fortune cookie at the beginning of each one of the episodes. So our first episode, A War on Two Fronts, the fortune cookie that shows up there, is fear is a malleable weapon. So depending on whose fear it is and how it can be used to like strengthen us. It can be used for us to move forward and like overcome these situations. But it can also, like, I love this in Rogue One, where Cassian says, let's make 10 men feel like 100. In this case, the fear could be formed into, listen, we are a small band, we're going to do something, but we got to make it feel like it's a big deal as well.
Yeah, and the fact that the emphasis is on fear being a malleable weapon, it shows that fear is essentially very raw. It's not something that comes into being directed. You have to grab it and direct it, and it puts the emphasis on the actor. And of course, we see how Saw wants to use fear, and he starts to break away a little bit from the other people as far as how he wants to use it.
Right. He's a little bit more aggressive. So in our next episode, we come up after A War on Two Fronts. We have front runners. And what happens here is the rebels decide that they're going to start attacking the droids throughout the city. They've snuck into the city. They're undercover. And it's this guerrilla warfare where they'll use the sniper attacks and they'll jump around. And they're starting to really make headway in taking out the droids. But I think that it was Obi-Wan who kind of warned them to be careful of public perception. And even though they are like sort of defeating some of the droids and stuff, that they need to prove that they really can win this war and not just cause trouble, but really win the war. So what is it you think about this episode, which is... let me go back to the cookie cutter, the fortune cookie. To seek something is to believe in its possibility. So in this case, they are seeking to retake the city, replace the king with their own king, and they're doing it a little bit at a time. How do you think that they are working to change the public perception? And how do you think that Saw is doing that versus Lux is doing that versus Steela's sort of like direction of these guys?
They have an argument in the episode that I think encapsulates it, which is when they're deciding basically what they want to do next. Saw wants to keep attacking the separatists to keep them off balance, and Lux says, no, what we really need to do is win the trust of the citizens. And you can sort of see at the end of the episode, Saw is sort of frustrated when Steela is elected the leader, because it suggests to him that they're going to follow Lux a little bit more, because earlier, remember, he was saying, we just need to fight. And she was saying, well, no, there's a place for words too. And I think when she is made the leader, he worries that they're going to be focusing too much on words. And they do start making speeches later. And I think you can see Saw not very happy with that. He gets a little bit tired of it because I think he sees it as moving too slowly.
Yeah, and that leads right into that next episode titled The Soft War. And so, Saw's concerned that, there are going to be a little bit more sort of like political and conversational and not enough action and fighting for what they believe. The fortune cookie here, struggle often begins and ends with the truth. So Saw is struggling with the fact that he can't do it all himself, that you can't just fight, and you need to have some of this concern. You need to be able to bring the people in so that you're actually have that support behind you. So he decides to go on his own to try and save the king. So the former king, King Dendam, has been imprisoned, and they have announced, King Rash has announced that they are going to go ahead and kill the king, because King Rash feels that that King Dendam is actually like leading the rebels from behind the scenes. So they've announced that he's going to be assassinated. Stella sees this as a ploy. She knows it's a trap, and she knows that this is a way to draw him out. And Saw says, "Listen, we need to do something, and something now." So he jumps out. He runs to go and like break the king out himself, and he ends up getting captured. I think this is a perfect example of the way that Saw approaches a problem versus the way that Stella does, and why she is actually the leader. What did you think about this scenario? Did you think that, Saw was, did it just seem that he was almost like falling right into the trap anyway?
Yeah, I mean, he doesn't think carefully enough about why the separatists might have let this news get out before they actually announce it publicly. I mean, remember when Stila hears about this, the courier who brings her the message doesn't say that the separatists announced it. She says that the separatists, that the market people in the market, the vendors, told her about it, and so
Right.
that's just a nice little detail where clearly they sort of leaked the information. And Saw didn't stop and think about why that might have gotten out when it did. It's clearly a trap. Again, Stila is the one who recognizes it because she's the tactical, sort of strategic, big picture thinker.
Right.
Saw's the actor. He's the one who just wants to go. You know, when Lux says that Saw shouldn't go off on his own, Saw says, go write a speech about it. And he is very clearly annoyed with Lux for essentially being more of a writer than a doer. I mean, he's done waiting around. He doesn't like this idea of treading carefully, worrying about your image. I mean, again, there's a moment in this episode where the separatist king says they fear diplomacy, they embrace mayhem. And, you think ahead to Rogue One, and that is the reputation that Saw's partisans, his rebels, that they've gotten for themselves. And it's clear to me anyway that Stila is really trying to avoid earning that reputation for her own rebels in this episode, but you see Saw not caring about that and really doing everything to validate that fear, or I should say to validate that reputation as people who fear diplomacy and embrace mayhem, because he really does seem to embody those two characteristics. And certainly when he runs off to save King Dendup, he doesn't pause, he doesn't try a diplomatic route. He goes right for the thing that's going to cause the most chaos.
Yeah, and I think that it's poignant to see that he is actually operating out on his own, and he has continued to operate on his own, doing what he feels is best and not taking others into that consideration. There were some other really key sort of like conversation points that I enjoyed in this episode. Now, after he was captured, he went right in over this balcony, and King Dendum was there kind of saying, "Who are you? What's going on?" He was captured and then tortured. And as he was being tortured for the information about the rebels, I believe it was King Rash that says, aligning yourself with the past does not bode well with your future. Speaking about being with the old king and moving forward. And this just helped to make Saw even more sort of resilient. And Saw, his response was, he said, "I'm not a terrorist, I'm a patriot. And resistance is not terrorism." And then Saw seems to have made an impact on that royal general, when he was doing this during this conversation. And we can see later that the general, I think his name is Tandem, he actually sort of like starts to believe in what Saw was saying. So in this case, Saw's actions has actually led to the conversion of someone else to his cause in the royal military leader, General Tandem. I'm sorry, you had something on that one? Or?
Well, I was just going to say two things. One, it's so funny how in sync we are, because I'm literally reading my notes and you're saying everything that I written down in the exact way that I wrote it down. So it's like we have some sort of psychic connection.
Right.
But the other thing that's funny is Saw is the person who doesn't care about trying to win people over. And yet he unintentionally, by showing how he has this conviction and this resolve and this moral compass, he ends up really convincing somebody who saves the day. I mean, that general comes in and sort of stops the execution of the king, and that's because of Saw. And that's not because of Stila. This general presumably already heard Stila's message, and it didn't turn him. But it's when he meets Saw and he sees that fire in Saw, and he sees that Saw is somebody who isn't going to break. That's what gets through to him, and that's something that Saw does completely unintentionally.
Right. And that's the thing, is that we don't ever want to discount the value of these actions. I've heard a quote said that, what you are thunders so loudly in my ears, I can't hear what you're saying. So, and that can go for both positive and negative. You can be a very bad example and say something very good, and nobody's going to listen to what you're saying because they see what you're doing. But you can also be someone who is at the front lines. You're leading the battle, you're leading the charge, and as a result, everyone wants to follow there with you. But I mean, maybe you're not saying all the best stuff. So there really needs to be this balance. I think that Stila is that balance for Saw Gerrera. And it doesn't work out. So our next episode that we get into from the Soft War, we see that, the royal general Tandem has helped save Saw, has helped save the king, and Ahsoka jumps in just briefly because the Jedi are not supposed to get involved in all of this. And then we hit the last episode in this series titled Tipping Point. And our fortune cookie for this one is disobedience is a demand for change. So when you hear that, when you read that fortune cookie and you think about where we've come so far, we've got the war on the two fronts, we've seen the front runners in the soft war, and here we are at the tipping point, and we have disobedience. So whose disobedience do you think is demanding the change in this scenario?
Well, I think it's very clearly the rebels who are essentially saying, we've tried this whole separatist rule. It's not acceptable. It's completely oppressive. There's no freedom here. We are going to take matters into our own hands, and we are going to fight back. I mean, the reason that these movements spring up is because peaceful protests and public statements don't get the attention of the oppressor. I mean, every rebel movement exists because the people who join it think that violence is going to get the attention and perhaps the respect or the concession or the surrender of the enemy. And I think the fortune cookie here sets up this idea that you have to listen to people who are being disobedient. You have to embrace the fact that people want to say in their future. I mean, when Stila and Dendup have been making these speeches, you see the people in the street kind of turn against the separatists. They start
Right.
Pelting the droids with fruit and all that kind of stuff, and that's disobedience too. I mean, if your city is occupied, attacking the soldiers is the height of disobedience, and
Right.
here you have regular people joining in that disobedience, and that is a demand for change. I mean, there's no way else to describe that.
And then I think the other sort of like point in here, and I agree with all of that. The other point in here that I thought was very interesting is that part of this disobedience was that Anakin realized that they needed help. They didn't have the means that they needed to actually finish off what they had started. And as a result, he turns to Hondo the pirate and buys arms and has it illegally shipped in. And Hondo is like, hey, I'm just here bringing stuff in. Everything is good. And so it's one of those really awkward gray, areas in war and in sort of like freedom fighting where you say, are we doing something that is, I say, every time I say the greater good, I'm thinking of Harry Potter. I'm thinking about Dumbledore and Fantastic Beasts. But is this something that is for the greater good? So it's okay to do something that is illegal or it is frowned upon if it turns out okay in the end and the good guys win. And that's part of the whole
Ahsoka
discussion.
has that. And Ahsoka has that too. I mean, Anakin keeps reminding her not to get attached to Lux, but when she is thinking about Lux, I mean, that's disobedience, and it's sort of a demand for change as far as how the Jedi see attachment. I mean, anytime you do something that isn't what you're supposed to do, part of the reason you're doing it is because you think that you should be allowed to do it. You're demanding a change in expectations. And I don't know if Ahsoka is consciously thinking that, but whether it's Ahsoka with Lux or Anakin with Padme, this particular kind of disobedience is implicitly a rebuke of the current system and a demand for essentially more flexibility. So there's a lot of that in this episode, both with how the Jedi approach arming the rebels and how Ahsoka approaches dealing with Lux, and just how the rebels approach, the rule of the new king.
And I think that inflexibility is very important in this whole series of the Clone Wars, because we see that, in my opinion, the true sort of downfall of the Jedi was their inflexibility. We
Yeah.
have good, we have evil, we have black and white, but our lives are not always that, stark. And as a result, we need to stay true to our own convictions, but understand and recognize when we need to be more flexible and when we need to let things go a little bit. And so in that amount of inflexibility, the Jedi fell, and Anakin, awkwardly enough, Anakin was one of those people that was like, okay, we can bend the rules a little bit here, but it didn't always turn out the best for him. So then the last part that I wanted to get to before we start talking about Saw Gerrera and his role in Rogue One and what we expect from him in the upcoming episode of Star Wars Rebels is I wanted to point out some other quick connections. So the super tactical droid that Dooku sent to help out King Rash is a droid named Kalani. And we got to see Kalani come back into action in Star Wars Rebels in an episode called The Last Battle, when Rex came and there was that Kalani and his droids had survived Order 66, basically.
Oh, that's right.
And Kalani was the one that was in charge of all of those droids for that last battle. I thought that was super fun that here we are talking about Saw Gerrera and his connection to the greater Star Wars storytelling universe. And there's Kalani staring right in our face that Saw is coming back. We just had Kalani coming back. Now, I also wanted to ask you, I'm not up to date on all of my reading, but as I was going through some of the prep for this, there's a section that I found online that I wanted to read and see if you were aware of these connections. So this is a little bit about the history of Saw Gerrera. So following the Republic's transformation into the Galactic Empire, Saw Gerrera fought against the Imperial military, organizing a group that became known as the Partisans. During this time, he hired a Lasat mercenary and fought an Imperial platoon under ISB agent Callus when they were sent to Onderon to bring peace. I think that was from the book Bloodlines, as well as from the episode where Callus and Zeb were stranded on that planet together. So I don't know if you had read about that, but then it says in 13 BBY, before the Battle of Yavin, Saw was tasked with protecting Jyn Erso, daughter of Lyn and of Lyra and Galen Erso, after the former was killed and the latter was taken by Orson Krennic. So Saw has been involved in some of these background pieces for quite a bit. Now, do you think that the Saw Gerrera that we met in these episodes of the Clone Wars is the same character that we see on screen in Rogue One? And when I say the same character, I mean the same characteristics. I don't know that I personally feel that they are the same sort of like characteristics, but I mean, what do you think has been going on to make the Saw Gerrera that we didn't even finish Tipping Point. So you can hit that. What do you think happened to Saw Gerrera in this Tipping Point to make him into the character that we see in Rogue One?
Yeah, I mean, the episode is very much a tipping point for Saw. I mean, he has been this kind of brash, overconfident, proud person throughout the episodes. He won't even admit that he can't figure out how to drive the droid tank. He just sort of gives up and lets Steela do it. And he prides himself in being competent, and he always seems like he's in control, and he's a little bit cocky. He's very much sort of Han Solo-ish throughout most of this arc. But then he loses his sister, right? I mean, he fires the rocket at the gunship. The gunship spirals, it hits the mountain, and ultimately the reason that Steela dies is partly because that, attack on the mountainside, kicks her over the edge. I mean, Ahsoka, gets shot and loses her force grip, but right. Steela wouldn't have been there in the first place if the mountain hadn't been blown up by the droid ship. So Saw obviously considers himself responsible. He even says that at the end of the episode. And I think what you're seeing in really the entire arc, but particularly that last episode, is Saw giving up emotional attachments, really giving up connections to people because he feels like it's too difficult. I mean, at the end of the episode, Ahsoka apologizes to Saw for Steela's death, and he says thanks, but it's over now. Let's just leave it at that.
Yeah.
And when I think probably when I reviewed that episode initially for theforce.net, I didn't pick up on that last line. I think I might have just written it off as he's dealing with his grief. But when you look at Rogue One, and presumably when you look at his appearance in Rebels, that's an incredibly important line because it shows that he's already beginning to harden himself. He's beginning to close himself off from other people. He just wants to focus on the mission. He doesn't want to get attached to people. Anakin has this line in the previous episode where he's warning Ahsoka to stay away from Lux, and he says, "Purpose must come before feeling."
Yes.
And it's sort of a reprise of what he said in the previous episode, which is a similar concept of purpose versus feeling. And of course, it's incredibly hypocritical because he's got this thing with Padme. They're a little bit married, but
a little
again,
bit. Just a little bit married.
But again, when you look at Rogue One and you know what Saw eventually becomes, it's not just that line isn't just important because of the hypocrisy. It's also important because it suggests where Saw is going. It's not that he puts more emphasis on emotion in these episodes, but he does have emotion for his sister. And once she dies, you can easily imagine him becoming cold and emphasizing purpose over feelings, in every aspect of his life. I mean, all those attacks that he conducts on Jeddah, when he puts innocent people at risk, I don't think that's the kind of strategy that you employ if you have feeling. If you are empathetic, if you are emotional, I think you would choose a different approach if you really worried about innocent lives. And what we see in this episode is the beginning of this emergence of someone who has a single-minded focus on purpose and believes that anything is justified because he has essentially cut himself off from feeling.
And I think that single-minded purpose leads to sort of his physical state of being. One of the things that I was thinking about with this sort of transition from where he is in the Clone Wars, where he shows up in Rebels, and then where he is in Rogue One is, his sort of introduction is as he limps into the scene. He's got one foot that is, this robot foot, and he's got this breathing mask that he needs to breathe. He has been so focused on his battle, focused on his war, that he puts himself into a situation that he is in physical harm. And as a result, he's losing himself. Literally. He is losing a foot. He is losing his ability to breathe. He's becoming sort of like crazy in his direction and his focus. It's interesting that they've had a couple of little commercials all about his appearance in Star Wars Rebels, and they're using footage from Rogue One and intercutting it with the animated footage that they're showing. And they use the line, "What will you become?" So as we see where Saw Gerrera started, as we see what he has done, what he has been willing to do in this fight for freedom, what has he become? He's become this half man, this mangled person, this lost soul. He's gone from this clean-cut hairdo to this wild, crazy man hair, right? He has really, he's been affected by all of this. I think that we've also seen a bit of footage where he is looking over a hologram of Steela, and he is haunted by his past, which brings us back to the title of these episodes that coming up for Star Wars Rebels is Ghosts of Geonosis. We have the Star Wars, crew of the Ghost. We have Saw Gerrera, and we have this battle over, what they will later will know is the Death Star, and all of these ghosts. And I think he's fighting a ghost as well.
Absolutely. There's a great page in the visual guide for Rogue One where we learn that the equipment that Saw is using to breathe is the result of Geonosian microbe infections that he gets when he goes to Geonosis. And he basically gets this parasite or some kind of infection, and it's eating away at his body, and so he needs this equipment to live. And I think we're going to see that visit presumably in these Rebels episodes. And I can't remember where I read it, but there was this description of him somewhere. It might have been the visual guide of him being essentially obsessed with finding the Death Star. That he hears these rumors about this planet killer or whatever it is at that point. And he goes to Geonosis. I think I read that basically the Empire picks up and leaves Geonosis not too long before he gets there, and he finds the remnants of whatever is going on. I think that's probably going to be these Rebels episodes. And when you piece together all of this, you get this image of somebody who is really just single-minded, again, driven by purpose, obsessed with the Death Star, even though he doesn't know that's what it's called. He'll go to any lengths to learn anything about it, even if it means getting infected with a parasite that eats away at his lungs, even if it means going into situations where he ends up losing body parts. I think that you said it great, that he is losing his humanity because he is just obsessed with this mission.
Right. And we also see that in this obsession, there also grows a bit of the paranoia. And I recently, in preparation for an interview for the novelization of Rogue One, I was reading the book, and there's a part in there where Saw is thinking about Bodhi showing up at the base and about Jin showing up at his base, and he does not know if the rebels are there to kill him or the Empire's there to kill him. Because in the same way that Cassian has had sort of like this gray area of where he's willing to do a lot of shady stuff to further the cause of the rebellion, Saw has been even shadier than Cassian.
Yeah.
And as a result, he doesn't know if Jin is there to kill him. And that was part of the movie as well. He doesn't know if Jin is there to kill him or really if she's there to learn more from him and further the cause. So he is, at this point of delimited of his handicap, his well-being, his mental health, and he is just on the edge.
Yeah, and it begins really in these final two episodes of the Clone Wars arc. I mean, in the last episode, Steela, is saying that they can't take the fight to the city and go door to door. And she says, if we fight door to door, no one is safe. And he responds, this is war, Steela. And it's kind of the beginning of him rationalizing these incredibly cold-hearted tactics with the understanding that it is all for one greater good, that it is all for one noble mission. And so when Jin shows up, he is evaluating her arrival in the context of a brain that is, single-mindedly ruthless and almost cruel. Somebody who recognizes that, you have to kill occasionally in a very disturbing way if you want to reach your goal. And I think what he suspects is that she has been sent by people who think about war the same way he does. That perhaps she is there to kill him. As disturbing as that might be, to achieve some greater good. I think he essentially misjudges how desperate the Rebel Alliance has become and thinks perhaps that they are willing to embrace tactics like his to silence him.
Right. And we see that, those tactics, are not too dissimilar from what Anakin was doing to help the rebels on Onderon get their start. This organization started by teaching these people how to be rebels, and then he has taken that teaching and continued it out to the extreme. But he's not a terrorist; he's a patriot.
Right? Exactly. Right? Yeah.
Well, Eric, I think that we covered everything from these episodes. We've talked briefly about Rogue One and how he connects. I am super excited to see Saw Gerrera show up. Forrest Whitaker will be reprising the voice for these episodes, and maybe we'll get some more callbacks to other characters. Potentially, Cassian Andor will show up as a Fulcrum agent. We hope. But do you have any final thoughts before we wrap up with this episode here?
I think it's a really great setup to Rogue One, and I think anybody who enjoyed the Clone Wars should go back, rewatch these episodes, and then go see Rogue One again, and then watch Rebels, or perhaps not in that order. Maybe watch Clone Wars, then Rebels, then Rogue One.
Right. And this one, I believe, is going to be a special two-part. It's going to be season 3, episode number 12 and 13, The Ghost of Geonosis. It will premiere on Saturday, the 7th of January. And I tell you what, I am loving Star Wars Rebels. I'm loving the Star Wars television stories and the way that they help to connect to a larger Star Wars universe. That they are coming back and forth and bringing them in and out is an absolute thrill to me. Equally as thrilling as being able to talk to you today about Saw Gerrera, his sister Stila, and all of the things that have happened so far in his life to bring us to the point of Rogue One. Eric, as we wrap things up, please tell us how people can get a hold of you, where they can follow up on the work that you're doing, and please drop some really nice, subtle Star Wars hints in some of your writing.
Sure. Best way to find what I'm doing is on Twitter, twitter.com/Eric Geller, EricGeller. I post links to all my articles there. And, we do try to put some Star Wars references in our morning cybersecurity newsletter occasionally, because we have a number of Star Wars fans who write for the newsletter. So you might see some stuff there occasionally. Follow me on Twitter.
Excellent. Thank you, Eric. And I'm Spencer Brinkerhoff. We're recording today live from Studios B3. I can be found online at facebook.com/SpencerB3, and that's also Instagram, Twitter, and everything else. So we'll see how this goes. We'd like to do some more episodes. If we get an opportunity, we'll be sure and call you back, Eric, and get some more of your opinions and insight. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right. See you all later. Good night.